Konnichiwa. Today, we're going to talk about a very important point raised by a comment made by Dennis Pulido. Do you have a video of the common problem of translating Japanese to English in your head and how to avoid or deal with it? And no, I haven't done a video on this, and I think it's about time we did, because it's very important to get past the stage where you're limping along in Japanese using the crutch of English. But how do we go about this? First of all, I'd like to look at the overall problem, and then we'll look at specific means of dealing with it. Now, the first point is a psychological point. We need to be able to set up a psychological base camp in Japanese. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, a lot of you watching this video, your native language is not English. This channel appeals quite strongly to learners of Japanese whose native language is not English, and I'm sure that while you watch this, you're not translating my English back into your native language all the time. You're listening to English as English. But many of you who are doing that right now don't do that with Japanese. You translate it into English or into your native language in order to understand it. So what's the difference? Well, obviously you've had more practice in English, which is important, but the main thing is that you set up a base camp in English. There's a part of your life, a part of your mind, a part of your heart that is based in English, and you can go to that place and operate in English. And you do that from a reasonably early stage. Obviously, when you're really just learning the basics, you can't do that. But from a relatively early stage, you start operating in English, doing things you want to do in English, using English as a language, a means of communication, a means of getting information, a means of enjoying media, a means of exchanging ideas, etc. Not as something that you're standing on the outside of, studying, wondering whether you're getting better at it, and sometimes practicing. There's a huge difference here, and this is fundamental to the whole question of whether we translate back and forth. So what are the methods by which we can get ourselves to this point? One method is what's called extensive reading, or tadoku. Now, I've talked about that before, but I'd like to talk about it here specifically in relation to the problem of eliminating translation into English or native language. The point about tadoku is not just reading Japanese, it's a particular kind of reading Japanese. And if you do it properly, there are quite strict rules, and in the past I've said those rules don't matter too much, and they don't for many purposes. But for the purpose of ending translation, they do actually matter. So the rules here are fundamentally that you don't have a dictionary. You read material that's below your current level, and you read it fast. You read it as fast as possible. You don't stop for anything. You don't look up words, even when you don't know them. If you encounter a passage that you really can't understand, you just skim past it and keep going. And for eliminating translation, this is important. You're going too fast to be translating everything. You're just reading the Japanese. Now, your mind is a great ally in this, because the human mind, as I've said on other occasions, is lazy, or to put it another way, efficient. It wants maximum input for minimum output. So the mind is actually quite happy to turn off translation, because it's another step. It's cutting out the middleman. It's doing less work by just taking in Japanese as Japanese. But you have to give yourself permission to turn off learning mode, to stop regarding Japanese as a language you're learning, to stop thinking of things like, how much did I learn in this session of reading, and let the mind's lazy mode kick in. This doesn't mean that you never again learn any Japanese. There's another kind of reading called seidoku, or intensive reading, and with this you do the opposite. You do look everything up. You do make sure you understand every last thing, and you learn from this. You don't actually learn from extensive reading, but what you do is you get much more used the language. And this is important for all kinds of reasons, which I won't discuss here, because we're talking about one particular subject, which is ending the translation habit. So the important thing just from that point of view about Taroku wide reading, fast reading, is that you're going faster than you would have to go in order to translate everything back and forth from your native language or English. And ideally, you come away from wide reading, not saying, I spent so many hours reading Japanese today, but I was reading a great book today. That's the important thing, where you can stop thinking of Japanese as Japanese, and just as the means by which you read a great book. Just as when you watch this video, you're not thinking of English as English, you're thinking of it as the means by which you receive the information that you came here to get. Another method is having a conversation partner or a conversation tutor. I've talked about this before. I prefer an unqualified conversation tutor because you don't need a teacher, you just need someone to have a conversation with. But if it's not an exchange partner, you're not spending half your time in English or your native language, you're just concentrating on Japanese. For the purpose of ending translation, you should specifically say to your tutor or your partner that you don't want to be corrected, you don't want to be learning Japanese, you want to be using Japanese. And again, the importance of conversation is that it goes fast enough that you don't have time to translate. You use things that you know, that you're comfortable with, and you use them at speed. And what you're concentrating on is the communication, the conversation, not the language. Now, if you can actually get a real language partner, someone who's also learning Japanese and whom you make a pact with not to use English, this helps a lot too. I won't talk about that too much here because I intend to make another video on that, and it's a very important thing to do if you can do it. Difficult to do because most Western foreigners don't like using Japanese as a means of communication. They only like practicing it and studying it, and that's why they never get any good at it. However, if you can find someone with whom you're simply communicating in Japanese, once again, while some of the time you'll struggle, and then you will be saying, well, how do I say this in Japanese that you thought of in your native language? A lot of your interchanges will be fairly commonplace, and your brain, which doesn't want to do any extra work it doesn't have to do, will skip the translation stage after a while. Now, failing this, it's also a good idea to have dialogue with yourself. Simply talk to yourself about what you're doing during the day. Once again, it'll get a bit repetitive, so you'll be talking about things that you've talked about before, that you know how to express, and you won't be needing to go through the translation stage. If you have imaginary friends, and it's not only children that have imaginary friends, and who knows if they're really imaginary anyway, this is even better. Make sure you choose imaginary friends who don't know any English, they only speak Japanese. Now, another method that I've talked about a lot in other contexts is listening to soundtracks or stories or whatever that you've already gone through with text or subtitles. So you know the meaning, you're pretty familiar with them, and you listen to them in the background of whatever you're doing, whether it's cooking, walking, washing dishes, whatever, anything that doesn't require your verbal mind. You just have it playing in the background, and even if you're not trying to listen to it, from time to time it will draw you in. You'll say, oh, that was that scene where that person did that strange thing. And because you're being drawn in like that, and because you recognize it, you don't go through the translation process most of the time. You're not worrying about that. You're just listening to it because it caught your interest. Now, on a more granular level, another important step in eliminating translation is introducing Japanese to Japanese definitions into your Anki, into your vocabulary learning. And I've done a whole video on how you can do that, how you can start it from a much earlier stage than most people do without going through this ridiculous monolingual transition that some people advocate. So what you'll have for a substantial number of the words in your Anki after a while will be Japanese definitions and or Japanese sentences that convey to you the meaning of the word. And I strongly recommend that you use TTS to turn these into audio. So when you look at a word on the front of a card, what rings in your mind immediately is that spoken Japanese sentence, that spoken Japanese definition. So even from the first learning of the word in these cases, you're never really thinking of it in terms of English. It doesn't actually matter if you looked up the definition in English in the first place. It doesn't even matter a lot if you have an English definition somewhere on the back of the card in case you get really stuck. The important thing is that provided you do know the word, provided you get it right, what you hear is that definition or that sentence spoken in Japanese. Unless you're having any difficulty, you don't even need to look at the back of the card. So these are some techniques for eliminating translation from your relationship with Japanese. In the end, the most important thing is to be using Japanese not as something you learn, not as something you practice, but as language, just the way you're using English as you watch this video. If you have any questions or comments, or if you have any techniques of your own to add, please put them in the comments below. I'd like to thank my Gold Kokeshi patrons, my producer angels who make these videos possible, and all my patrons and supporters on Patreon and everywhere. Thank you all so much. It gives me so much help and encouragement to have your support, and I'm happy that we can all go forward together with this natural approach to Japanese, making Japanese not something we play with, not something we study, not something we strive to get really good at, but language. Our language. これからもよろしくお願いします。Class dismissed.